and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the UK-based leftist Christian podcast that has a confession to make. We are all, in fact, dogs painted to look like pandas. My name's Adam Spears, and I'm joined today by Jonny Bell, whose name I nearly just forgot somehow, Jonny Bell. Not sure how that happened. I might just do that all again, you know.
I mean, my middle initial begins with an A, so it could have been
Jonny Bell. It's like Thomas A. Becket. You are the new Thomas A. Becket, even though apparently it was never at any point Thomas A. Becket. It was only Thomas Becket.
Really?
Apparently so. Yeah. Apparently that thing was just put in there later for some reason. Makes it sound fancy.
It was the Victorians.
I think so. It's always the Victorians, isn't it?
Basically, they fucked up quite a bit.
Yeah. Have you seen this story about the dogs from a zoo in China painted to look like pandas because they couldn't get pandas? Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I love it. It's like we still want the tourism, but we can't afford to get the tourism.
To be honest, I feel like I would probably pay to see those dogs painted to be pandas before I paid to see actual pandas.
Absolutely. It's a bit like the... I forget where it was. Was it Spain with that image of Jesus that was restored by one of the congregation members?
Yeah. Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing.
And they've got so much tourism as a result.
Have they actually? That's amazing.
It's really helped them.
And it's the fact it was like some old grandma somewhere who's just like, I can do that. It'll be fine. We're going to talk today about democracy, but this is actually going to be the first episode of a two-parter. There are going to be two episodes talking about democracy. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on the kind of political side of democracy. And then in the next episode, we'll talk more about church politics. How does democracy function or not function in the church? So do join us for that one as well. We are not joined by Ben Molyneux Hetherington because he has had to stay late at work. So yeah, it's me hosting using Ben's notes. So if anything goes wrong, it's completely Ben's fault. Also, I do reserve the right to just absolutely rip it out of these notes as we go along.
I mean, it's his own stupid fault for having an actual job with actual responsibilities. So
exactly, and a job that helps people, that helps young people, having a hard time at a crucial point in their life. What an absolute woke cuck that guy is. I can't stand him. So why don't we begin with a bit of what else is on my mind, Grapes?
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
I've got a couple of things on my mind, Grapes. The first one is, it's on my mind, Grapes, because Ben put it in the notes. So this is a Guardian article. The title of it is "Rich Countries Silencing Climate Protests While Preaching About Rights Elsewhere, Says Study," which I think is hardly surprising. I mean, we kind of see it all the time, don't we?
Indeed. I mean, Marika Rose in one of her books points this out of things like when the Russian Olympics are happening, people were outraged over their anti-LGBTQ plus stuff, yet ignoring the fact that that we are continually diminishing LGBTQ plus rights.
It's hypocrisy on a grand scale. And we've seen the kinds of sentences that, particularly now that climate protesters are getting in this country, we've seen the law changed, specifically targeting climate protesters and a few others, but specifically climate protesters.
Yeah.
Bringing in really draconian sentencing and police powers and that kind of thing. I've also got one other thing on my mind, Grapes. This is something that popped up on my phone today, and it's absolutely incredible. The headline is from The Independent. It says, "Scientists grow lost tree mentioned in Bible using mysterious 1,000-year-old seed," which is crazy. Like, that's genuinely amazing. Have you seen this?
I have. I had a read of it, and you kind of think. I mean, it sometimes has clickbaity names things, but actually, it was really interesting, and it's amazing.
Yeah. I thought it would be clickbait, but yeah. The fact that seeds, you could still grow things out of seeds 1,000 years later is.
I know, it's remarkable.
Yeah, but apparently the resin is mentioned in biblical texts. It's called TORY. Which is apparently highly prized in the ancient world for its use in perfume, incense, cataract medicine, embalming agents, and antidotes, apparently. So,
I mean, it's very difficult to know exactly what it's useful for. So it may have been associated with those things, but whether it actually helps with any of those things, considering we used to, do bloodletting to help balance your humours.
Well, and
for however many centuries.
Let's be honest, we still, there are people who still believe some really fantastical kind of things.
Yeah.
Whether this tree actually worked for the things that it was used for or not, we don't know. But it is incredible that they have found it. They think so. They call it the Sheba tree, and they think it is a candidate for the balm of Judea, or the Judean balsam.
I should have looked this up. See where it actually says it in the Bible. Oh, Genesis. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So I assume that balm is...
Oh, it's got to be the balm, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Not like the Life of Brian thing where it's like, oh, it is a balm. A balm? What are you giving him that for? It's a snake or something.
Yeah.
It was a eye-opening moment on my undergraduate theology course when in my, I think it was a blasphemy. I think it was blasphemy module. So I did a module on blasphemy.
That's great.
Yeah. And we watched Life of Brian. And listened to our lecturer do a lecture on the life of Brian, and it's heartbreaking, really. And you can see it now. Like, I just had never considered before just how kind of liberal Life of Brian and kind of the majority of Monty Python's stuff actually is. But you don't necessarily consider it until you have it pointed out to you, because it's such a classic, brilliant film. You just sort of take it for what it is, and then when they're pointing, the lecturer's pointing out, well, he stood there saying, "You are all individuals." Yes, we are all individuals.
It's funny actually, because I often think that, I mean, obviously they weren't that left, but they were still left for their time, and I often think that, in 50 years' time, when we're older, maybe less than that actually, because health problems, will we be considered not that left anymore because things have moved on? I don't know.
I mean,
you will be, Jonny. Yeah. Me associating myself with the church.
I think the thing is, they were considered left still within a mainstream political kind of framework.
Centre left, I suppose. Yeah,
they've never been radical. I don't know if I think libertarian is probably a stretch too far, but certainly on the whole, free speech kind of thing, that's where they're kind of approaching stuff. So they're definitely liberals, but also I think there's differences between them as well, because I think you look at someone like John Cleese, especially these days. He's just gone really sort of. He's just your typical kind of shitty granddad views, isn't he?
Yeah.
That was a hell of a tangent from 1,000-year-old seed.
I was going to say, with the tree, I mean, plants, there have been a number of things. I think there was a date as well that was kind of resurrected, as it were, fairly recently as well. And it's just the resilience of some organisms is really quite remarkable. And in some ways, if we do end up destroying ourselves, there is still hope that plants and other things will still continue.
I mean, I think this is the thing, is like, I don't think that humans are going to be wiped out, right? I think humans will continue existing. the issue is not the complete extinction of the human species. The issue is the suffering, not just of humans, but actually of arguably sort of the planet as a whole. A lot of people, a lot of animals, a lot of plants, fungi are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those species are going to go, and indeed have gone, extinct. Humans, I don't think, will be one of those, but there will be so much suffering of humans and others that it marks a catastrophe. So I think humans will survive as a species, but that doesn't mean, if there's 10,000 of us, we've survived as a species, but how many people have had to die because of that, and how unstable has the planet become because of that,
Yeah, absolutely. Cheery.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's move on to something else, shall we? Today we are talking about democracy. And as I said before, these notes were written by Ben, who is not joining us today.
What a dick.
Yeah, so you'll have to bear with us. I'm going to ask these questions and make these points as if I were Ben, even though I might not necessarily agree with them. How does Ben sound? Maybe I should put on his voice.
It's a bit deeper than yours.
Yeah, and he breathes in his microphone a lot, like...
Yes.
Oh, I'm Ben. I'm from Bracknell or whatever it is. Okay, here's the first question.
Sounding like
also, we've got a really echoey room. Yeah. So maybe
that's true, yeah.
And make it sound like I'm in an echoey room. Anyway, I'm going to stop dicking on Ben quite so much now. Sorry, not sorry, Ben, if you're listening to this. So the first question that Ben has written on here, well, it's not a question, actually. It's a statement with a question. It says, when people hear you're a communist, they ask, don't you like democracy? What do you make of that, Johnny?
I mean, yeah, it's that Red Scare stuff of thinking that communism is anti-democracy because, the USA and the UK and the rest of the West are, real pro-democracy. I mean, the fact that one of the main consequences or outcomes, I should say, for communism is towards, my understanding of it anyway, is towards a form of democracy.
I mean, this is something that we will probably talk about. I didn't expect it to come up quite so soon, but obviously you and I come from different parts of the left, I guess. So I'm a lot more, I'm an anarchist. I'm influenced a lot more by anarchist ideas. But I'm an anarchist communist. I'm an anarcho-communist. So I'm still a communist, but I'm also an anarchist. And actually, one of the really important things here... So I was saying before we started recording, actually, that the fascinating thing with Ben's notes is that he has understandably sort of assumed a very positive idea of democracy, right? Like there are arguably versions of democracy that we wouldn't agree with. But I think Ben overall has written the notes in a way that suggests that democracy is a good thing. In anarchism, there is a live debate about whether democracy is actually even good or whether it's an anarchist value. Some anarchists will argue that basically what we're after is direct democracy, whether that be kind of a consensus form of democracy, consensus decision-making, or whether that be maybe at times when necessary, kind of majority decision-making thing. So a lot of anarchists will go for consensus decision-making, which I think can be a really good thing. I've lived in places that use that as a model. But then there's this whole other kind of side of the argument within anarchism that says, actually, no, we're not into democracy because that comes with all kinds of baggage. It's, historically, it's not been a good thing. It's not been representative of anarchist ideas from the earliest days of the Athenian state, where, the idea of democracy was born, arguably. So what we're actually into is free association. So I'm not sure from the outset that I agree with the framing, because I'm not sure I do agree with democracy as such. But a democratic society, whether that be sort of majority rule or consensus, is going to be a better thing than, say, an oligarchy.
And it's interesting, actually, because with the Methodist Church, it seeks to be more consensus based in how it does its democracy. But one of the big issues, which I'm sure we will unpack a bit later, is how people engage with it. So, for example, in the church, the local church, for the church council, in order to make decisions, you have to basically decide to be on that church council, to be a trustee, in order to have that kind of level of decision making. However, you can choose not to be involved with it, and there are also some stipulations that you can't have. With 50 or more members, you can't have everyone on the church council. So there's something in how people engage with that process, but also how people are potentially pushed out of it because they're not able to fulfill the responsibilities and everything of being a trustee. So their power to make decisions is subordinated.
Yeah, and I think it raises some really important questions about who gets to participate in democracy. That's one of the key things, going back to the anarchist critiques, is that, there are these kind of, much with liberalism, these built-in exceptions to who gets to participate in democracy, right? So on a state level, foreign nationals don't get to engage in most levels of democracy, most levels of decision making in the place where they live. Prisoners don't get to vote. They don't get to engage in democracy, which is a big problem because prisoners are a group of people who we have locked away, who we have deprived of their most fundamental right to freedom.
Yeah.
And they don't even have a voice anymore. The little voice one might argue representative democracy gives you.
Yes.
They don't even have that, with a few exceptions. Children is another one that I think is interesting. Why don't we let children have more of a say in the decisions that affect them? All of these groups, whether you agree with letting them participate or not, there are all of these exceptions, these groups that are built-in exceptions within democracy. And that has been the case all the way back to ancient Athens, where this idea of democracy was born.
Yeah. Women and enslaved people. They weren't allowed to vote.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and of course it wasn't until, what was it, like 1919, or was it later than that? I know, it was 1928, it's a bit later than that, so about 9 years later.
I don't believe it was all women either.
No, it was women over 21 from 1928. Because I think was it men over 21?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Men in the armed forces could vote from the age of 19.
Oh, incentivization there.
Well, that'll do it for me. Sign me up. I think this is one of the other things as well, actually, the sort of getting onto this kind of voting thing and the right to vote and participate in democracy and all the rest of it. I went to vote in the last general election and came out of because I'm a bad anarchist, and came out of the polling station and bumped into someone who I live near who was on the way to vote. And we had a brief sort of interaction, said hello. I can't remember exactly how it went, but somehow topic of why we were voting came up, and I sort of said, well, for the little good it may or may not do, I might as well. That's how I see voting. I don't think it is going to make a huge difference because you can only ever really vote for people who are firmly within the system as it is. And her response was...
There's no box to tick to say, I think these are all terrible.
Well, yeah, I mean, they will argue you could spoil your ballot or whatever. But there's an argument against... Sorry?
It's illegal to spoil your ballot.
It's illegal to spoil your ballot?
I thought it was.
Well, no, because they still count them. They still count.
They do count the spoiled ballots, but I thought you weren't allowed.
12 seconds later.
No, apparently not.
Oh. I wonder why I was told that then.
Well, I think making it illegal to spoil your ballot, like, part of the reason they say at least go along and spoil your ballot is because it actually lends legitimacy to the system as a whole. They say, well, if you don't like any of the options, you can just go and spoil your ballot, right? And it's not even that it's fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally not there to serve most
the
people,
majority,
right?
Yeah,
It's there to serve an elite, which again, is one of the criticisms that anarchists have of this concept of democracy, is that rule by a majority is still something that infringes on the rights of minorities and so on. So anarchists try to build in specific ways to listen to minority groups within the way they do things, regardless of what that is, what that looks like.
In a bit, I'll probably talk about Deleuze.
Of course, you fucking will.
but what you're saying of that free association stuff, there is a great parallels between Deleuze's thinking on democracy and what the anarchists say, which is really interesting. I think it's coming at it from very different places, but the result looks quite similar.
Well, I'll quickly finish my anecdote because I think it ties in quite well to this. So anyway, before I was rudely interrupted. So I said I vote because I might as well, for the little good it may or may not do. And she responded, well, I vote because people fought for my right to vote, i.e. suffragettes and so on. And I hate that answer. I hate that answer so much. It's such a stock answer as well that liberals love to give. Because what is the point of voting for something regardless of whether people apparently fought for your right to be able to vote, if that entire system is set up to manufacture consent, to trick you into keeping things as they are? Yes. Right? Surely at that point, you don't want to be lending legitimacy to that system by going to vote for it, by going to vote for someone within that system. You want to tear that system down. So it's not that I'm saying that it's bad that, women have the right to vote now, right? It's not that I'm saying that the suffragette movement was wrong or anything like that. I'm not.
I mean, you're just masking the fact that you're a massive incel, aren't you?
Yeah, clearly. Yeah. It's fascinating, actually, how suffragettes have been and continue to be used again to legitimize the system, because they fought for the right to vote within that system, that they are used to legitimize that system.
And ignoring that loads of them supporters of fascism.
Yeah, well, indeed, overt racists.
Yeah.
But also, as well, used by people who, the best they'll argue for often is that you should be able to protest non-violently. I think that we should move on to our next question that Ben poses to us, which is quite a fascinating one. He says, is the UK a democracy? He gives some points with this. So he sort of says, the head of state is an unelected monarch. The House of Lords are unelected. Press ownership, I think that's a really important point, is focused in the hands of a few people. Workers don't generally have control of their workplace. So these are all sort of deeply undemocratic and even anti-democratic things that we just have and take for granted. So are we a democracy even?
I mean, Adam, of course we are. We get to choose who we put into Parliament or the House of Commons to make decisions about the law. There's nothing to do with how the law is enforced with the judiciary or police or anything like that.
It's just about whether it's a red rosette or a blue rosette committing or condoning a genocide. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is genuinely an important question, though, right? Because
yes,
but and again gets back to what I was saying before about there being so much baggage with the term democracy and so many things built into it that don't discount it from counting as a from being a democracy, that on the face of it go against the core principles of democracy if you agree that they are the core principles of democracy.
Yeah, and even etymologically, demo, people, crassy, power. Like, it's people power. There's something really interesting as well. So, now, were you in teaching still when they brought in British values? I think we've had a similar conversation before. Yes, yeah. And part of the British values that every education provider has to kind of include in their lessons and things is democracy. But there is something really interesting about how you talk about democracy and what democracy is by assuming that we have democracy and is something that makes us British. And therefore, if we are in a democratic system, then that's a good thing. Therefore, we don't need to question it.
Yes, it's a very specific idea of what democracy is, how it functions, what it does. And democracy means representative democracy, right? State-run kind of representative democracy. Whereas, the democracy of places like Cuba, for example, the way they do democracy there, because they're not an ally, because they're seen as, rightly or wrongly, as filthy commies. Actually, that's not democracy. Or Venezuela, that's not democracy. Despite the fact that these places consistently are shown to be more democratic than we are.
And actually couple that with the fact that it's illegal to criticize capitalism in schools. There's something that you then make the association that democracy and capitalism then go hand in hand. And if you're being taught that from a very young age, what does that then do with the incoming population and how they are unable to consider different views or be exposed to different views during their formative years? There's something, actually, thinking about it, more concerning than I had realised in that.
Yeah, exactly. These British values, they are fundamentally rooted in liberal capitalism, right? I should probably just do let's go through them, actually. So we'll go, Jonny, democracy, good or bad?
Why, in relation to the British values? Well, clearly it's a good thing, I got it right.
Okay, fine. I don't think that's not meant to be that you get it right. I mean, I would say...
representative democracy, bad.
There we go. No, what I mean is, so I'm gonna go through. I'm gonna say, do you like these values on the face of it, or do you dislike these values? What did we do before? I think I said before it was like trash or pass, but I think I got that wrong because it's meant to be. What's it meant to be? It's meant to be
smash or pass.
Smash or pass. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So smash for yes.
Yeah. So would you smash?
Great,
would you smash democracy? So democracy, smash or pass?
Absolutely. Smash.
Okay. So the rule of law, smash or pass?
Oh. Pass.
Individual liberty.
Individual liberty. I find it really difficult to take these on the face of it.
I know. That's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem.
Damn my critical thinking. Smash.
Okay. Mutual respect.
Smash.
Tolerance of different faiths and beliefs.
Smash.
Okay, so the really fascinating thing with these is mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs are wonderful things, according to this, unless you have different beliefs about democracy, the rule of law, or individual liberty. I mean, this is the thing, is that there are...
Or are Muslim or are... not British.
Yeah. Well,
the early prevent training was so Islamophobic.
Oh, yeah. Awful.
It has changed now, and it is better, but the underlying thing still is massively Islamophobic.
I mean, this is the thing, though, right? So, like, if you, as a teacher in a school, if you hear a student, they used to call them learners, and now they call them scholars in a lot of schools, which I just hate.
Fuck off.
Scholars.
We called them learners. Scholars, my goodness.
What's wrong with student? What's wrong with student? I don't like pupil, but what's wrong with student? You know?
Well, it's just rebranding it and making it more and more vacuous.
Exactly. Anyway, so technically, if you hear a student bad-mouthing any of these 5 core British values, you're supposed to report them to Prevent.
Yeah.
Which is insane. That's insane.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, any teacher in their right mind is going to have a second thought before they do that. But the reality of it is that there is a huge contradiction at the heart of these, but that doesn't really matter to the people who wrote them, because these things aren't really supposed that they're signaling something, right?
And they absolutely. They're dog whistles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are dog whistles signaling that you have to toe the line of liberal capitalism within British society.
It's creating subjects that are compliant within a narrow framework of how you are, in inverted commas, meant to be. And it is surprisingly controlling. It's interesting. When I was a teacher, I did have some critical thinking, but I didn't have as much as I do now. But even then, I was kind of going, this isn't right. But I couldn't work out why it wasn't right. And a number of my colleagues were the same. It's like, this doesn't feel right. What's going on? But without the language to articulate what was wrong, there was little that we could do.
I think this really plays into the next thing on the notes, actually. So this idea of, how democracy works, or how it functions as an ideological tool. And there are so many ways we can see this. So using British values actually as a starting off point from this, because I think they are used, all of them are used as an ideological tool. But democracy in particular is used as an ideological tool, especially by the government, in a number of different ways. So it's that idea, as I said before, about having sort of legitimacy, sort of having popular sovereignty, where, this idea that this government has been elected democratically is used to kind of legitimize its authority. It's seen as that's an expression of the people's will.
Yes.
It's also something that ties into how political discourse is framed. So things like national identity, these are British values. Democracy is a core British value. We have this sort of democratic heritage, if you like, and it's sort of used to foster a sense of patriotism, of national pride and that kind of thing, which in and of itself is something that governments are able to use to get away with all kinds of shit.
It's a bit like, when was it? It was South Park episodes a few years ago with member berries, with these little berries that they would be eating that would just be reminding them of this nostalgia.
The guys at work told me about them. Been taking them about 6 months now. I'm telling you, they really take the edge off. Oh, they're adorable.
Oh, and remember Bionic Man? Remember Chewbacca again? Oh, I love to remember Chewbacca. Hey, remember when there weren't so many Mexicans? Oh, I remember. Remember when marriage was just between a man and a woman? I remember. Oh, I remember. Yeah. Remember feeling safe? Remember no ISIS? Remember Reagan? Oh, I remember. Oh, remember. Oh, remember.
And a lot of the patriotic rhetoric is harking back to that kind of the good old days, and how we could make it like that again.
And it's polarizing, right? It's rhetoric used to other people like refugees and asylum seekers and other people migrating to the UK, all kinds of groups, already marginalized people.
Well, it's people with less power.
Exactly. Yeah. But also people who are considerably to the left. So people like us, really. Again, it's this sort of scapegoating thing, but it's presented as, well, actually, this is the will of the people. Perhaps a majority, or even if it's not a majority, it might be presented as a majority or a very loud voice. People actually, they want stronger borders. They want to stop the boats. That's the will of the people. It's the democratic will of the people, and this party was elected on this platform. So it's used in that way to marginalize those kinds of people.
And the kind of creation of subjects kind of comes to this. It's almost the cause and effect is happening at the same time. It's I'm telling you what you should want, therefore you want it. And that's kind of what they're doing.
It's this idea, actually, of manufacturing consent, isn't it? We return to it so often, but governments aren't just enacting a mandate, right? They're not just enacting the apparent will of the people. They are also shaping public discourse.
Yeah.
Ash Sarkar from Novara Media, she has a wonderful turn of phrase, and one that sticks in my mind is that I think applies here is shitting in the swimming pool of public discourse.
That's so good.
I have my criticisms of Novara Media, but a lot of the time it's a case of they're about the best you're going to get if you want sort of regular sort of news coverage from a lefty perspective. But yes, that's a wonderful turn of phrase, and I think it applies here because that's exactly what it's doing. So there's all these kinds of ways that democracy is used as an ideological tool by governments, and beyond governments as well, but largely by governments, to basically do what they want, to scapegoat people, and also to ride roughshod over sort of fairly basic rights that we have. So obviously, we referred earlier to the many changes of law that have been brought in to attack climate protesters in particular. And again, democracy, the will of the people is used as a way to justify that. So I guess to round out this first section, I guess that we have to ask a question. Maybe we don't even have to answer it, but Ben asks in the notes, why do we still think democracy is important? I mean, do we still think democracy is important? I've already sort of outlined some of my potential issues with it. Do you still think democracy is important?
Yes, but it depends what you mean by democracy. There's something really important about the kind of values of solidarity, compassion, and increasing both human and non-human dignity.
Are they democratic principles, though?
Not necessarily, but I think they are involved with democracy. They're not exclusive to democracy, but how I understand democracy, they are incredibly important. Because if we're talking about
that's so fundamental, isn't it? That how I understand democracy, this whole thing.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Adam, careful there. You're moving towards postmodernism. Things being subjective. Danger.
All right. Why don't we'll return to the theme of democracy in a moment. Why don't we have a Saint of the Week?
Saint of the Week.
So the first thing I want to do is apologise, partly on Ben's behalf and partly on my behalf, for reading this out. Because Ben has put in the notes his Saint of the Week, but his Saint of the Week is, as he puts it, the first and probably only Tory Saint of the Week.
We need a button on the sound desk saying dun dun dun.
Yeah, sort of the opposite of, because I've got the air horn. We need the opposite of the air horn, don't we?
Yeah.
Maybe for now I should just go, or even. Again, though, it is too long, that bleep. I need a shorter bleep. Either way, I did not write this. It's Ben's fault. Ben is kicked off the podcast for this week, at least, for nominating a Tory Saint of the Week. And this week's Tory Saint of the Week is Joseph Rayner Stevens. So, Joseph Rayner Stevens was born in 1805 in the north of England, and he became a Methodist minister.
Gross.
Yeah, I would never fraternise with the likes of Methodist ministers myself, but
turncoats.
So apparently, he is a Methodist minister in Cheltenham for 5 years before he's booted out for advocating the disestablishment of the Church of England, which of course was unacceptable at the time. Now, this actually is the first part for me where I question whether it's accurate to call this guy a Tory. Because a fairly core ideal of Tories at the time, I think even Tory radicals, as this guy is described, is actually support for the monarchy.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit skeptical, actually. I don't know. This is part of the reason I wanted Ben to do this is because he says this guy's a Tory. I can't find any information anywhere that says this guy is actually a Tory or that he identified as a Tory. Ben later on in the notes says that he's a Tory radical in that he opposes some of the Whigs and their support for factory owners and believes that it's the duty of the upper classes to look after the lower classes and felt that they were failing to do so. Now, that is quite a Tory-ish value. So if he believes that, that is very, it's this kind of what we might call one nation conservatism. But that kind of has lost all meaning these days because a lot of Tories claim to be one nation conservatives, but don't really follow that ideal as flawed as it is.
Yeah, it's one of those terms that's kind of lost its meaning and people just use it willy-nilly.
Yeah. So it's frustrating, really, because it's like you end up, when you're a person on the left talking about this kind of thing, you end up sort of, on some level, having to defend the idea of one nation conservatism because the alternatives in conservatism are so bloody awful. But to be clear, we are not one nation Tories.
I think that's stating the
Deafening
obvious.
Silence there, Johnny.
I mean, Adam, my blue hair, the real reason.
Yeah, I have my suspicions. Anyway, so Joseph Rayner Stevens, getting back to him. So after he is kicked out and not allowed to continue, he does get support from some Methodists and he goes and sets up his own churches, which are called Stephenite churches. And he begins to campaign for factory reform and against the poor laws. So factories were, as we know at the time, horribly exploitative and unsafe, and very, very little was done to protect workers. And the poor laws led to people being sent to the workhouse. And he also became associated with the Chartist movement, which was a movement. Now, Ben's written that this is a movement that looked to democratize Parliament. That is true, but it was, their demands were quite, I mean, certainly by today's standards, quite limited, right? So it was basically they wanted, well, certainly the majority of them wanted men to be able to vote. So yes, the Chartists were seen as very radical at the time, but you can make an argument that that is very much of the time, and they were not the most radical. And as Ben points out, in the long run, most of its aims were actually adopted anyway. So Stevens would address Chartist meetings and use his moral force to support their arguments. And he argued for the working class to arm themselves so the government would take them more seriously, which is huge. Again, and that's also, another thing where I'm like, is this guy a Tory? I genuinely don't know how much we can describe this guy as a Tory. There are a number of key principles of the Tories at the time, right? So this is not to say that they're the key principles now, or were key principles for a long time after that, but certainly in the sort of early to mid 19th century, things like support for the monarchy. And it's worth bearing in mind that, like we see in today's parties, there were factions. But yeah, the key principles were support for the monarchy, defense of the established church, right? So we've already seen that is a principle that he didn't support. Social hierarchy and landed interests. So part of the thing in Ben's notes is that he was against some of the kind of more nefarious stuff that was going on in terms of factories, capitalists essentially. And it's worth bearing in mind that there are competing interests between landowners and capitalists, right? So by the early 19th century, you're really seeing capitalism starting to flourish, really, and feudalism is well on the way out. But there's still a lot of, we still have remnants of feudalism today, right? So, I live in a place that is still technically owned. It's on lease from the estate that exists as the result of centuries of feudalism. So it's an estate that was originally owned by a feudal lord and is now a company, an organization that administers the land, the property. So that is a feudal kind of relic, really. It's a remnant, a piece of leftover feudalism.
A lot of the area around where I am is like that, which is really interesting.
A lot of the way we administer land in this country is still really feudal, actually. So, yeah, it's worth recognizing those competing interests there, because that might teach us something about Joseph Rayner Stevens' form of Toryism. So, then we've got skepticism of rapid reform. Again, is this something actually that he supports, that he agrees with? Skepticism of rapid reform? He's telling them to arm themselves. Economic conservatism, so favouring the interests of landowners basically over the sort of emerging industrial capitalists, and favouring protectionist policies. So, maybe, but again, I think it seems that his key issues were actually the people themselves, the workers in the factories, rather than, say, the interests of landowners against the factory owners. And then this moral duty of the upper classes to the lower classes. So it's obviously a very paternalistic idea, but it was better than a lot of the stuff that was going around at the time. Yeah.
Yes.
And finally, anti-liberalism. So the other party at the time were the Whigs, who were basically the party, as we've seen, the party of capitalists, of factory owners, and they wanted what we now know as classical liberalism, which is very much into sort of individual rights and some good things as well, the expansion of suffrage. But this is where sort of liberalism really is starting from. So I just, to me, it's a very, very mixed bag in terms of whether Joseph Rayner Stevens actually adhered to these things or even a majority of these things. So I don't know. And Ben sort of recognizes the, as I said before, he recognizes that there's some sense in which this might not be quite true on the face of it, but ultimately he says that he was a Tory in the sense that he was against the factory owners. So we'll take that at his word. So anyway, yes, he did indeed campaign for factory reform, address Chartist meetings. He was arrested in 1839 and charged with speaking at an unlawful meeting seditiously and tumultuously, met together by torchlight and with firearms, disturbing the public peace. Which is a hell of a law, isn't it?
Indeed.
I'd quite like to go down for that one. So basically, apparently, just attending a meeting like that was a criminal offence, right? And he was found guilty and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Ben says it was an offence at the time. I think it'd probably still be an offence now, to be honest, right? If you're attending a meeting.
Yeah, it probably wasn't repealed. Yeah.
And it's probably just sort of reworded. If, an unlawful meeting, talking seditiously, meeting together by torchlight and with firearms and disturbing the peace. Meetings, as we've seen recently, have been broken up and the people at them arrested and convicted for far smaller things. So, yeah. Anyway, he gets out of prison. He goes to prison for 18 months. He gets out in 1840, keeps a low profile for a bit, but then in 1849 starts campaigning for the enforcement of the 10-hour working day, which, was supposed to be something that meant that people could only work 10 hours, but it wasn't enforced. So people were forced to to work for a lot longer. Yes. And he campaigned for enforced machine stoppages, which meant that it wouldn't be possible to work for longer than 10 hours. And he continues campaigning for the rest of his life. During the cotton famine of the 1860s, when demand for cotton dropped massively and many workers became unemployed, he campaigned for relief from poverty and for that relief to be better distributed to people who needed it. He set up a radical newspaper, campaigned against child labour, founded a group of radicals called the Fielden Society after his friend who was a Chartist MP and a Methodist minister, John Fielden. And he supported the idea of founding a National Miners' Association, which eventually became the National Union of Mine Workers. So clearly a radical guy, especially for the time. Not sure he was a Tory, but...
Indeed, it doesn't...
I'm still...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, isn't there, that kind of makes that weird. And
the fact that he created something that became the Union.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is what Ben says in his notes. He says he is described as a Tory radical. He was Tory in the sense he opposed the Whigs and their support for factory owners. He believed in the duty of the upper classes to look after the lower classes and felt they were failing to do so. He certainly wouldn't see much to like in the modern Conservative Party.
No, and I suppose back then there wasn't much option. There wasn't much choice in what you could, in terms of what parties were available to you. So
yeah,
going with what's the most closely aligned to your principles.
Yeah. But I do have a bone to pick with Ben on this particular point, because in a previous episode, when we were talking at least partially disparagingly about William Wilberforce, not entirely disparagingly, but partially disparagingly, Ben said, well, fuck him because he was a Tory or something like that. And I said, no, he wasn't a Tory. He was independent. To which Ben said, yeah, but he basically was a Tory because he aligned with them on most things. Now, this was a very, very similar time to this guy. I think this guy's a little bit later. But I think if we're going to allow this guy to be a saint of the week, and Ben says himself that this guy was a Tory, even if he was a Tory radical, then I think Ben owes me, the podcast, and all the listeners of the podcast a grovelling apology for disparaging the name of the wonderful William Wilberforce.
Do you think we need to get a petition going? Or should we just cancel Ben?
I think it should be cancelled. I think it should be cancelled.
Sure, proportionate.
We should have a cancel. We should have a cancel button, shouldn't we? That we can play a sound, and that means you're cancelled.
What would it sound like? Would it be like a
Well, I guess it'd be. So yeah. Ben is cancelled. I'll finish with this. So this is a quote from a book about him, which Ben says he's slightly edited to modernise the quote, but it's from an introduction written by his nephew, who describes Stevens as having a strong individuality, an intense sympathy for suffering, a chivalrous sense of honour, a passionate hatred of oppression and avarice, a contempt for all that is mean, vulgar, and sordid, all regulated by a deep religious spirit of love for God and humanity. Thus, he was a political priest, a soldier servant of Christ, fighting under the banner of the cross. A disregard of success, money, and social position led him to say what he had to say, and to do what he had to do with earnestness and fearlessness. He had moral courage. The part he played on the world stage, he played to satisfy his conscience and his God.
High praise.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this guy is his nephew, so... But yeah, I mean, this guy sounds like a good guy, and I think I will begrudgingly, because it's Ben, I will begrudgingly accept him as a saint of the week, and add him to our canon of saints. What do you think, Johnny? Do you agree?
I would approve him, yes. I mean, I did question it when you said he was a Methodist, but you know.
Yeah, well, that's what I did before we got you on the pod.
Understandable. I mean, we're not proper.
Splitters. Anyway, that is our saint of the week for this week, Joseph Rayner Stevens.
Saint of the week.
So I think that will do us for today. We are going to do another episode on democracy. We're going to focus a lot more on democracy in the church in the next episode. But for now, we will leave it there. Jonny, is there anywhere that people can't find you, can they? Because are you too old? Is that what it is? Are you too old for social media and the internet in general?
I think
you are the granddad of the podcast, aren't you? So, like,
yeah, even though I don't look it. Well, no, I guess I'm as elusive as a fart in the wind.
I might add that to our soundboard just for you, and introducing Jonny as elusive as a fart in the wind. Have you ever heard? It reminds me of something that Billy Connolly said once, where he said that the sound of his own voice was like a goose farting in the wind.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Anyway, so we can't find you. You're elusive, and that's fine. You can find me on TikTok, on Twitter, probably a few other places as well. I forget. At Commie XIAN. You can follow us. You can go to our website, breadandrosaries.com. You can go to our Patreon. We have a Patreon that you can find as well. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/breadandrosaries, Twitter @bread_rosaries, or you can email us, breadandrosaries@gmail.com. Please do that. Or you can text us. If you look in the show notes of this episode, it will say at the top, send us a text or something like that. And you can send us a message, and we may or may not read it out and address it. But please do that. We are always happy to get messages. Please do rate and review us as well. It really, really helps if you can rate and review us on, what are they these days? Apple Podcasts. I don't think Google Podcasts exists anymore.
No.
But any place you can rate and review us. Go on Reddit and shout about us. Tell your friends on Facebook, all the rest of it. It really does help. So thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.